Dear guests, dear colleagues, dear friends, today is already the second time that we meet to bestow the Human Roots Award, and I'm pleased to see that many of you have also joined our award ceremony last year. With the Human Roots Award, we intend to draw an arc between us today and our behavioral evolution in the past, with the aim of promoting our humanistic agenda of staying human in the future. Having said this, we wish to emphasize the crucial importance of Pleistocene archaeology. We Pleistocene archaeology are the custodians of the material archives that formed over the last 3 million years as a result of hominin behavior. We contribute not only to what makes us human, but also test and calibrate hypotheses from other disciplines about the evolution of our behavior, hypotheses which are quite often translated into directives for the future. We believe that Pleistocene archaeology can play a prominent role in the integrative orchestra of disciplines whose subject is man, but to achieve this we must provide Pleistocene archaeology with a voice in order to communicate the importance of what we're doing. This particular kind of communication forces us to think and to read outside of our comfort zones, and this is definitely nothing the academic system rewards. But for us in Monrepos, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise. And this is basically the reason why we're all here together today. We only recently began with this particular kind of communication in Monrepos, but through this innovative work, we have already noticed that we are definitely on the upgrade. If we keep our eyes peeled for upcoming global trends in society that are likely to sustain for the next couple of decades, we'll find that the old will become the new, so trend researchers say. A hybrid society bringing together Silicon Valley and rural Wheat Valley, it is the fusion of high-speed, high-tech and slow craftsmanship is what trend researchers foresee for the immediate future, with folk costumes coming back into fashion and all dyed in that brown color that we already had during the 1980s. Fashion upcycling and retro style are just two of the very bizarre harbingers of these future trends all of you know. Needless to say, both our current and new research topics in Pleistocene archaeology differ little from the topics we debated during the 1980s, even though one must say our debates today are founded on results of new methods that have surely revolutionized our thinking. In this context, it is of course no wonder that we now pose questions which were provocative in the 1960s, the 1980s, and are still provocative today, of what makes us human, what exactly makes us human between nature and nurture. With a return to past material cultures, a new flourish in public awareness of ancient studies and also especially archaeology is to be expected. And this is a prognosis that keeps us and our mission for Pleistocene archaeology quite optimistic for the future. Unfortunately, not only positive things have happened since we met last year. On the 2nd of June, Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt passed away. Professor Eibl-Eibesfeldt was the founder of the discipline of human ethology in the 1960s, and his research was driven by the search for human universals. He was an inspiring thinker whose research was not undisputed. Especially his theory on the xenophobic inheritance of humans provoked tremendous critique, although today, in view of the global refugee crisis, this research cannot be more up to date. Professor Eibl-Eibesfeldt supported our agenda wholeheartedly, and we are left behind having lost a patron and a trailblazer who provided us with a tremendous amount of food for thought. And instead of spending a minute in silence, as is the custom, I would like, together with you, to give a huge round of applause to pay tribute to this pioneer thinker. Yeah, thanks for joining me in this. Now we have a new patron, and it is really with very great pleasure that I would like to announce that Richard Dawkins has agreed to follow Professor Eibl-Eibesfeldt in the patronage of our award. Professor Dawkins, who does not need further introduction in this cycle, in this round here, received our award last year, and we are very proud that we could attract somebody as eminent and prominent as Richard for this particular position. With the Human Roots Award, we honor archaeologists or scientists from neighboring disciplines for their achievements in the understanding of human behavioral evolution. Our laureate in 2018 is Harvard Professor Steven Pinker, cognitive psychologist, linguist, and the author of numerous popular science books, and, to quote Stephen Fry, the leading public intellectual of the English-speaking world. Having Steven Pinker as our guest means that Monrepos now participates in the illustrious cycle of institutions and people, among them Bill Gates, with whom Steven exchanged and debated over the years, and this provides Monrepos also with that little bit of extra sparkle that ancient studies, and especially Pleistocene archaeology, so urgently needs. So before Richard Dawkins gives the laudatio for Steven and confers the prize, I will pass over to Lutz, who will provide you with a wrap-up of the relevance of Steven Pinker's hypothesis for what we are thinking in Monrepos.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, dear Steve, so as Sabine already mentioned, you are amongst, if not the leading intellectual and humanistic thinkers today. And your award-winning books on perception and thought in our brain, the language instinct, the human nature, and not least the role of violence in human history are all bestsellers in the popular science literature. And for sure, your new one, Enlightenment Now, is lining up. This enumeration is reason enough to hand the Human Roots Award 2018 to you. But last year we had Richard Dawkins, and this year's patron of the prize. And as you can imagine, we talked a lot about the famous selfish gene. And of course, we, the donators of the prize, we are also selfish in our choice of the laureate, who must fit to our agenda and should bring some scientific glamour, as Sabine said, to our castle. So glamour was quite easy, and but thinking about the matches between your work and the way you think and what we are doing here in Monrepos, and at least the inspiration you gave to us for our exhibition, for us it was quite self-evident that you are a must-have. The award 2018 can only go to you, and not to George Clooney. So as a psychologist, Steve has a nativist view on how our brain works. So this view assumes that certain skills and abilities are hardwired in our brains already at birth. So we are not a blank slate. So much of our complex human nature, a universal nature that we all share and have in common, is based on adaptive behavior and has a long evolutionary history. Parents are liable for their children, that's nurture. But ancestors are liable for their descendants, that's nature. So according to Steve, the expanding field of evolutionary psychology becomes more and more important to explain aspects of our behavior and emotions that are so familiar to us all today, so like beauty, gameplay, religion, or our sexuality. But our history is encapsulated in a black box that covers the last, let's say, 3 million years of human evolution. So it's only our discipline, archaeology, which deals with the material record of our behaviors in our long evolutionary history. So to understand the whens, the whys, the hows of our behavioral evolution, archaeology is a major interdisciplinary contributor for understanding our behavior today. And Steve is an eye and door opener for such an interdisciplinary thinking and working. But there's even more, because Steve goes far beyond explaining the human status quo today, but he always draws perspectives for the future on science-based and humanistic thinking. Every day, when we turn on the television, when we're reading the newspaper in the morning, when we listen to politicians and top managers, we get the impression that something is really going wrong. That the challenges we are facing are overwhelming us, that our societies are drifting apart, nature is irreversibly disturbed, and our global cycle systems are also to be quite unbalanced right now. And the way we tackle these issues don't seem to be very productive. So for example, when the president of the most powerful nation on our globe declares climate change to be a hoax and a political agenda of scientists. So even the late Stephen Hawking wasn't very optimistic and advised us to abandon our Earth and find another planet. So here Steve has a totally opposite attitude, best expressed in his contribution about violence in human history. For him, the world has become more and more peaceful in the last millennials. So we are on the right path in our future. And it is a pleasure to see that you can also reach a large audience with an optimistic perspective amongst all the dreadful states of evidence that we have to consume every day. Steve's perspectives for our future are based on science and history, statistics, and humanism. The better we understand the long process of becoming human we are today, the better we will succeed to stay humans in the future. So I reiterate, archaeology can be a major contributor for this understanding. Archaeology is not about the things that happened a long time ago. Archaeology is about us today. But coming back to violence, so what makes us violent? Going on raids or even on war? Are we really the violent xenophobic species as Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt has suggested a long time ago? What is lying in the black box with all the material remains of the last 3 million years when our behavioral evolution occurred? So usually when we address our deep history, we avoid looking into this black box. We take a detour to ascertain what has to be inside. For example, by looking at the behavior of our closest relatives. But is the aggressive male-dominated chimp the role model for our ancestors? Or is the more docile, female-dominated bonobo a better one? So, and if so, is the violent past in us really responsible for war and warfare? Steve says it's getting better in the last millennials. And maybe the domesticating impact of our civilizing process helped us. But what happened in the 100,000 years during our behavioral evolution? Is our evolutionary past covered with blood and thunder? Or was it quite the opposite? So then we have to ask, what went completely wrong in the more recent past? So Steve rejects those ideas that assume that we have an inherited thirst for blood or a death instinct that makes us aggressive and violent. For Steve, our violence has several psychological motives and environmental as well as social triggers. So these motives are our inner demons, like our practical predatory behavior, dominance, ideology, sadism, or revenge. But there are also better angels: empathy, self-control, moral, and reason. These inner demons and these better angels we have to detect in our archaeological black box of our evolutionary history. That's what we have to do. And as I said, Steve was a great inspiration during our work for the exhibition. When you have taken a guided tour this afternoon through the museum, or previously on another occasion, you could have encountered some of these key behavioral features in us, so Steve's demons and angels, in the different rooms on your journey through our deep history. Here, all ingredients for us, for the soup that we call human violence, war or warfare, were planted in us and we spoon it up since then. You could have encountered the empathic pack hunters, the Neanderthals, or with the society animals, the earliest glimpses of ideology. Initially, a better angel, but more a demon for us today. But you could also have recognized that from our archaeological perspective, war is a rather recent but omnipresent phenomenon in the history of humankind. Well, nonetheless, Steve's prospects for us is optimistic. This should encourage us all to do everything that this optimism pays off. In order to build the best of all possible worlds for us, we strongly believe that understanding the deep roots of our behavior that we decrypt from the archaeological record has to be considered. We tend to think that we are free and unconfined in everything that we do and that we want, but we cannot escape from our human nature, and we can't act against it. It's quite the contrary. We should be very mindful of our nature when we make decisions for short or long range. To understand our human condition today and make decisions for the future, we can only draw on our deep history where everything began. Our long history matters. And Steve is the most prominent advocate for this attitude. Enlightenment now, nothing is more urgent today. So Steve, we are much more than grateful to have you here as our second awardee. And it's an honor for me to move over now to Richard, our this year's patron of the prize of the Human Roots Award. But I must warn you, I did it again, Richard. So as with Steve, Richard is also famous for his dangerous ideas. And so in one of his last tweets, Richard recommended Steven Pinker as a Nobel Prize candidate. For literature, yes. A Nobel Prize is a Nobel Prize. But anyhow, Steve and Richard, as I said, we are very selfish, and we feel relieved that this didn't happen this year, and that you are not in Stockholm now, but you are here with us in Monrepos. Thank you, Stephen, for being here, and from England, Professor Richard Dawkins.
Thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be back at Monrepos, and a huge honor to be the new patron, especially in succession to Professor Eibl-Eibesfeldt, who, as we've heard, passed away sadly this year. I met him only a few times, and I vividly recall his boyish charm, his immense enthusiasm for our subject, our collective subject, and his kindness. I had dinner in his house with a group of other people, and I was really impressed by the way he spoke English and German kind of alternately, as though out of courtesy to his English-speaking guests, but also giving them a little lesson in German at the same time. It was very gracious, it was beautifully done, very charmingly done. As it happened, during that dinner, the news came through from Jane Goodall of warfare in chimpanzees in Gombe Stream. And Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt was beside himself with excitement. He said, "Das ist fantastisch, fantastisch." He was overjoyed with this news, and it was very, very exciting to be in his presence at the time. I was also delighted to hear from Sabina just now that Stephen Fry had nominated Steve Pinker as the English-speaking world's prime public intellectual, because I had said exactly the same thing in the tweet which Lutz just put up. So I'm doubly pleased to have chimed in with another great hero, Stephen Fry, and saying Steve Pinker is indeed our prime, our number one public intellectual in the English-speaking world. He is wonderfully readable as he introduces non-specialist readers to his own specialist subject. But what's truly remarkable is that he does it for several different subjects. Unlike a typical science journalist, he's a world-class expert in all the subjects he writes about. However different they may be, his scholarship is as deep as his writing style is gripping. I blush to admit that the first time I heard of him, he was described to me as the Richard Dawkins of linguistics. I read The Language Instinct, Der Sprachinstinct, and was immediately extremely gratified by the comparison. I would love to be called the Steven Pinker of anything. And he has gone on to become the Steven Pinker of so much else. For of course he didn't stop at linguistics. Our understanding of the evolutionary roots of human psychology will never be the same again after How the Mind Works. Wie Denken im Gehirn entsteht. Every page of this magnificent book gives the mind something to work on. Steve raises the game of the reader. He doesn't just inform the reader, he stimulates us to have stimulating thoughts of our own. One particular point occurs to me: emergent properties. The mental skills that our ancestors needed for planning a hunt, for example, would need no additional hardware to be pressed into software service to do any task that requires logic, deduction, induction, hypothesis testing. Just as electronic computers designed to do calculations need no further hardware in order to play chess or run an airline timetable or design clothes or something. Maybe the recursive, hierarchically nested software evolved eventually to do language, but evolved previously to do planning of behavioral operations such as hunting forays, and was thus automatically available to be pressed into service, to be sequestered as language grammar when language came along. Steve is courageous. He doesn't hang back from controversy, and he's made himself unpopular in circles that should know better. His book, The Blank Slate, Das Unbeschriebene Blatt, burst into a culture where many social scientists had an attitude to genes we might satirize like this: I suppose we'd reluctantly have to admit that genes exist, but we suspect them of being nasty fascist things, in which they'd all just go away and leave us to do our social science the way we always have, without having to learn any genetics. The Blank Slate takes a mercilessly critical look at the whole question of nativism versus environmentalism. I'd always regarded Shakespeare's nature or nurture dichotomy as rather a dull topic. Yet The Blank Slate is a thoroughly entertaining book. It takes a Pinker to achieve that feat. In Words and Rules, Wörter und Regeln, Steve returned to language. He uses the clever technique of zeroing in on such details as regular and irregular verbs and zooming out to illuminate, well, how the mind works. After achieving so much, you might have expected him to rest on his very considerable laurels. And now that I think about it, a laurel wreath would look quite becoming on the famous coiffeur. By the way, Steve's one of the few people, I'm one of the others, who's had their complete genome sequenced. And one of the genes they found in Steve's genome was one for being completely bald. Just shows how much you can, well, never mind. But anyway, resting on his laurels was exactly what Steve did not do. He went on to produce what can only be described as a magnum opus, and Lutz has already made allusion to it. The Better Angels of Our Nature. He moved into a completely new field, namely history, including archaeology. It is a magisterial work of history, but unmistakably at the same time, the work of a scientist, and a scientist at the very height of his powers. The Better Angels of Our Nature, Gewalt, is not just a scholarly tour de force. It's a document of hope and optimism. Hope and optimism are much needed today, of course, and that very fact should make us suspicious of anyone who steps up to offer them. But our suspicion is battered into submission by the sheer weight of scholarship. And if weight of scholarship suggests heavy going, that's exactly wrong. The book is light and easy reading, good company, witty and amusing, like its author. Any normal public intellectual might have been satisfied with one magnum opus. But Steve's 2018 work, Enlightenment Now, Aufklärung jetzt, bids fair to be his most important book yet. At a time of almost universal pessimism, like Better Angels, it gives us a more cheerful view of our human predicament, looking not through rose-tinted, but realism-tinted spectacles. The realism comes from deep knowledge of our human roots, informing a shrewd and penetrating acquaintance with modernity. As you've already seen from Lutz's slide, I think it's high time the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to a writer on scientific themes. The nearest precedent is probably Henri Bergson, regarded as a scientist in his own time, although his penchant for mysticism would disqualify him today, at least I hope so. His belief that life was powered by a mysterious élan vital was memorably satirized by Julian Huxley's attribution of the movement of a railway train to élan locomotif. Steven Pinker would have no truck with such obscurantist nonsense. He's a true scientist. If my dream of a scientist winning the Nobel Prize for Literature is ever realized, I cannot think of a truer or more worthy candidate than him. And it will be nice to think that the Human Roots Award got there first. Steven Pinker, I'm delighted to present to you the Human Roots Award of 2018.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Lutz. Thank you, Olaf. Thanks to all of you for coming. This is a tremendous honor, and the Monrepos Award, to say nothing of the that other prize that's mentioned, reminds me of the acceptance speech of the American comedian Jack Benny when he got some award, and he said, "I don't deserve this, but I have arthritis, and I don't deserve that either." The honor is multiplied by the fact that the patrons of the award are two of my scientific heroes. Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt was a true pioneer in understanding human psychology in an evolutionary framework, and I still use many of his examples in my undergraduate lectures, perhaps my favorite of which is his documentation that in all human cultures, the eyebrow flash is used as a friendly greeting, and so I would like to greet all of you this evening with, in honor of Irenäus Eibl-Eibesfeldt, with an eyebrow flash. And the honor is multiplied yet again by the patronage of one of my heroes, Richard Dawkins, who has influenced me not just in my understanding of life and mind and human nature, through his books beginning with The Selfish Gene, The Extended Phenotype, The Blind Watchmaker, Climbing Mount Improbable, which have deeply informed my understanding of life and mind, but also his model as an English prose stylist. One book that Richard did not mention has not been translated into German. It is The Sense of Style, the Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, and I began my writing style manual with the advisory that to really become a good writer, one shouldn't just follow rules in a style book, but one should reverse engineer examples of excellent writing when one comes across them. And the first example that I gave was a passage from Richard Dawkins' Unweaving the Rainbow. So thank you, very much, Richard. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to speak about my most recent book, Enlightenment Now, Aufklärung jetzt. And it begins with some deep questions that all of us ask ourselves. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as deep and difficult as these questions may seem, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but have more trouble identifying what they do believe. In my book, Enlightenment Now, Aufklärung jetzt, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment. Namely, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. And as a result, they've faded into the background as a bland status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I've tried to offer. The Enlightenment, I suggest, revolves around four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress, and let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. As a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. We generalize from anecdotes, we as a species. We reason from stereotypes. We seek evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our virtue. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment value, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can try to understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment ideal was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like other beliefs about the world. The third ideal is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other conscious creatures. Well, enhance human flourishing, you might think, who could possibly be against that? As it happens, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical force or dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather small, and we naturally feel the pain only of our genetic relatives, our close friends and allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, including education, journalism, art, mobility, and even pure reason. As soon as I engage in discussion with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Finally, we get to the ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because intellectuals, I have found, hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-do-ism with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to Voltaire's character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, which, as it happens, was Voltaire's satire of Leibniz, so perhaps it's suitable that I bring this up in an event that is partly affiliated with the Leibniz Society. Well, as it turned out, Professor Pangloss was what we would today call a pessimist. A true optimist believes there can be much better worlds than the one we find ourselves in today. But all of that is irrelevant because the question of whether progress has or has not taken place is not a matter of wearing rose-colored glasses or seeing the glass as half full or having a sunny disposition. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit that would be progress. Well, let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then with the invention of vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy has increased worldwide to 71 years, and virtually no one guesses that it's that high. 80 in the developed countries of Europe and the Americas. But in Asia has recently caught up, and sub-Saharan Africa is rapidly closing the gap as well. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low average lifespans was child mortality. In Sweden in 1750, for example, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought its rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and the rest of the world followed suit, including Canada, South Korea, Chile, and Ethiopia, whose rate of child mortality has been reduced from 25% to less than 5% in just 20 years. Sustenance. For most of human history, the struggle to feed oneself has been only intermittently successful. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed a moderately active young man. And for the first time in history, Britain was able to grow that many calories because of advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation during the British Agricultural Revolution. Later, the invention of synthetic fertilizers here in Germany, the mechanization of agriculture, the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids during the Green Revolution. And so other countries have followed suit. More recently, China, India, and the world as a whole has been able to grow enough calories to feed their populations. Now, one might say that this is a dubious example of progress if all of those calories are just making fat people fatter. But in fact, the world has reduced the rate of undernourishment from 35% in poor countries in 1970 to less than 15% today, starting in Latin America, then in Asia, and it's now happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Thanks to this abundance of calories, famine, which was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and could strike anywhere in the world without warning, now is a rarity and is a result not of crop failures or an inability to grow enough food, but from wars and geographical remoteness that prevents the food from getting to where it is needed. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth to speak of. We can see this in a graph of the gross world product from the year 1 to the present, which shows that for more than 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. But then with the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, the spread of education, the institutionalization of markets and finance, and the globalization of trade, gross world product has increased by a factor of 200 since the 18th century. Again, this would be a dubious form of progress if all of that wealth just went to the 1%. And in fact, it has been highly uneven across the world's regions, with the UK and US and Germany showing a similar curve, escaping from universal squalor and poverty first. But in recent years, Asian countries like South Korea have shot up, as have Latin American countries like Chile, and China and India are showing exponential growth as well. There's the graph for the world as a whole. As a result, extreme poverty, defined as the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family, has declined from 90% of the world's population 200 years ago to less than 10% of the world's population today. In fact, there's been a 75% reduction in extreme poverty worldwide just in the last 30 years. Because of this development, international inequality, the gap between rich countries and poor countries, which necessarily increased with the Industrial Revolution as some countries escaped from universal poverty, leaving the others behind, has now turned a corner, and international inequality has started to decrease because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Now, of course, within developed countries, inequality has increased, but that does not mean that developed countries have become more indifferent to the plight of the poor over time. Quite the contrary. For hundreds of years, rich countries devoted about 1.5% of their gross domestic product to redistribution to the poor, to children, to the sick, to the aged. But in the 20th century, every developed country had an expansion of social spending. So today, a median OECD country redistributes 22% of its GDP. Because of this redistribution, poverty, when it is measured after government benefits, has decreased, even in a country with high inequality like the United States, from 33% in 1960 to 7% today. When poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy, taking into account the plunging prices of food and clothing, then the rate is less than 3%. Peace. Olaf, in inviting me to speak this evening, asked if I could mention some data on Paleolithic archaeology that might be relevant to this book, and so I'm going to talk about an application of archaeological data to one aspect of progress that I explored in The Better Angels of Our Nature, Gewalt. It speaks to the question of whether, when we look at the history of war over the course of the human species, is it a story of progress that is decreasing rates of war, or decline, increasing rates of war? This is an ancient question, and it was perhaps most famously raised in an exchange begun with Thomas Hobbes in 1651, who speculated that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, namely a government or state, they are in that condition which is called war. And in that condition, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau equally famously answered that nothing could be more gentle than man in his primitive state, and all ulterior improvements have been so many steps towards the decrepitness of the species. Now, both of these men were speculating from their armchairs. Neither of them had any idea what life was like before states, before government. And so the matter was open to speculation for literally many centuries. And in fact, until the 1990s, the picture of the history of war was obscured by what I think of as the anthropologists of peace fallacy, which I name after a number of anthropologists who declared themselves to be advocates of peace. And they worked according to the following dubious logic. If war is ancient, then war would be in the genes. That would imply that humans will always wage war, and working for peace would be a waste of time. Working for peace is important, therefore war cannot be ancient. Now that's only a bit oversimplified. You can actually find an argument like this almost in so many words in in the writings of a number of ethnographers, up to the present day, I should add. I think it should be clear why it is a fallacy. It would be like saying that ancient humans could not have had infectious disease, because it's very important that we combat infectious disease through advances in medicine. And if we as a species are prone to infectious disease, it would mean that medical research is a waste of time. Therefore, there was no infectious disease in prehistoric times. I think the first archaeologist who who questioned this general line of thinking, which led to, I think, what many ethnographers and archaeologists might see as a kind of an empirical bias in the field to try to minimize any evidence for prehistoric violence, prehistoric aggression. This was first noted by the archaeologist Lawrence Keeley in his book War Before Civilization, which came out I think 23 years ago, in which he called attention to this, to what he thought of as a spin doctoring or a suppression or a biasing of data, both in ethnography and archaeology. And he called attention to the prevalence of violence, including collective violence, coalitional violence, warfare, if you'd like, in prehistoric societies, citing evidence from forensic archaeology, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, bones with arrowheads embedded in them, and mummies preserved in bogs that were found with a rope around their necks. In my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I reproduced Keeley's data, and I added a few other estimates of rates of violent death in archaeological sites. I think I found between Keeley and Samuel Bowles and Azar Ghat, I think 21 archaeological sites for which rates of violent death had been estimated. And as you can see, they span quite a range. And there are sites that have no violent deaths. There's some that have almost 60% of the remains show signs of violent trauma. The average of these sites was about 15%. And that, needless to say, is much higher than one finds in more recent societies. For example, one estimate of deaths in warfare in Europe and the United States in the 20th century says that about 6/10 of 1% of the deaths were due to warfare, and this includes, of course, both world wars. If one were to attempt for a higher estimate, putting in all the deaths from genocides, all the indirect deaths from disease and warfare that are collateral damage from wars, you can get a figure of about 3%. And if one looked in the 21st century, the rate of death in warfare is about 3/100ths of 1%. Well, these data came out 23 years ago in Keeley's book, and they have been criticized because it's hard to tell. I don't have to explain this to most of the people in this room. It's often difficult to tell whether one should attribute signs of violent death to war or personal violence, homicide, although in small-scale societies, when you have a homicide that is then inspires an act of revenge, and then revenge for the revenge, and you get cycles of feuding, it's hard to know where to draw the line between interpersonal violence and warfare. But there are other uncertainties, in some cases uncertainties of dating, in other cases underestimates or overestimates of rates of violent death from skeletal remains, and the question of how representative this particular sample of sites that Keely cited and that I reproduced are. Since The Better Angels of Our Nature came out, there have been a couple of studies that have tried to fill in some of the uncertainties from the archaeological record, and I'll cite just two. I'm sure they're familiar to many people in this room. One was the report by Marta Mirazón-Lar, Robert Foley, and many others of a quite remarkable site excavated in the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, which showed 27 skeletal remains that showed unmistakable signs of violent trauma. Again, I won't go through them since I'm not the expert in this room on how one does the forensics to ascertain that the bodies met their end through violence, but it was unmistakable in this particular site, including many skeletons with skulls that had been bashed in from behind, arrowheads embedded in bones, and a woman who appears to have been tied up before her skull was bashed in. This shows that at least in this group there was an unmistakable coalitional aggression, what we would call warfare, in a society that was not just pre-state but was hunter-gatherer before agriculture and without signs of horticulture or herding. Again, that's just one site, and perhaps the most comprehensive survey of the archaeological literature, probably the opposite of Keely in choosing a few sites. This one perhaps was too inclusive, according to some critics, a study by Jose Gomez and his collaborators, where they looked through into their analysis every study they could find in the archaeological record and the ethnographic record to put rates of human violence in phylogenetic perspective. And I'll just cite some of their conclusions, which I should add, by the way, before introducing these numbers, that there are several different questions one can ask about rates of violence using the archaeological record. One of them is, were there higher rates of violence in hunter-gatherer societies as opposed to other forms of social organization, of horticulturalist, herding, tribes and chiefdoms as opposed to bands? Another question one could ask is, has there been a decline in warfare over time? Was there some transition in the archaeological record between high rates of violence from warfare and low rates? Neither of these is relevant to the question that I asked and the question that divided Hobbes and Rousseau, which is not about hunting and gathering, not about a transition in time, but rather the effect of states. That is, does the imposition of state control lead to a pacification that reduces rates of interpersonal violence, raiding, and feuding? And those three questions are often conflated in the controversies surrounding Keely and myself and others. So the relevant one is the comparison between non-state and state societies. And here, Gomez et al. Concluded that the rate of percentage of deaths due to violence in bands, tribes, and chieftains from the archaeological record was between 3.5% and 14%. Trying to also restrict evidence to the archaeological record, the proportion of deaths that were violent deaths among states was 1/4 of 1%. If you try to corroborate that difference with a different kind of evidence, say the ethnographic evidence or evidence from the present, once again they found that in bands and tribes living out of the control of states, the rate of violent death, that is proportion of deaths that could be attributed to violence, was 10% for bands, 4% for tribes, and 1.3% for states. So I take these later studies as not corroborating the point estimates, but as confirming the hypothesis that state societies have lower rates of death from warfare than non-state societies. Let me turn now back to the data that I review in Enlightenment Now, and in particular the history of war in historical times, in particular in modern times. One generalization about war over the last 500 years is that whereas at the beginning of the modern period, the major states and empires in the world were pretty much always at war, and peace was merely an interlude between wars. One can see this in a graph that plots the percentage of years in each 25-year period in which the great powers of the day were at each other's throats in major wars. And what we can see is that several hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea more than 65 years ago. If we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even as wars were becoming rarer and shorter, they were becoming more destructive, culminating in the First and Second World War, which had unparalleled concentration of a number of deaths per year. But contrary to predictions that I grew up with, that it was only a matter of time before the world would see a Third World War, pitting the United States against the Soviet Union, fought with nuclear weapons and therefore more destructive even than the First and Second World Wars, the Soviet Union went out of existence, the Cold War ended, and World War III never happened. If, in fact, we zoom in on the period after the Second World War, we see that there's been an uneven but unmistakable decline in the rate of death from all wars, including civil wars and wars between smaller nations. How could this have happened if we descend from people who had high rates of warfare? Well, it's because, like other changes, other kinds of progress that I will be speaking about this evening, they are the result of human institutions, workarounds for the darker parts of human nature, the opportunities for the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put it, to subdue our inner demons. In the case of war, these would include the rise of democracy, because democracies are somewhat less likely to fight each other, a hypothesis originally advanced by Immanuel Kant. The growth of commerce, another hypothesis from Immanuel Kant, that countries that trade with each other have less of an incentive to invade each other because you don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors, and if it's cheaper to buy things than to steal them, you are less tempted to engage in plunder. It also due to the rise of peacekeeping forces from the United Nations and other organizations that act as referees that get in between warring countries, and changes in international laws and norms. Organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, and international laws and norms that make conquest something that is no longer acceptable. It used to be that, as von Clausewitz said, war was the continuation of policy by other means. Might makes right, and to the victor go the spoils. That is no longer the accepted norm among nations, and conquests have declined greatly. The fact that the Russian conquest of Crimea in 2014 was considered such an outrage and not recognized by the rest of the international community, even though it was a tiny bit of territory that used to belong to Russia, is a sign of the changing norms, all of which collectively have resulted in the decline of war, even with the presence of warlike sentiments and desires which we hear all too often, but which fortunately are less likely to result in actual shooting. Freedom and rights. We have all read with dismay and fear about the rise of autocracy in Russia, in Turkey, in Venezuela, in Poland and Hungary. But nonetheless, if you look across the world and you add up the number of democracies and the number of autocracies scaled by how democratic or how autocratic they are, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. Whereas the world used to have a handful of democracies embracing 1% of the world's population, nowadays 2/3 of the world's countries are more democratic than autocratic, and 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. Now, some people are surprised when they hear this because we have all been told that democracy is in retreat. But remember, just as recently as the 1970s, the world had only 31 democracies. It seems almost perverse to say this in Germany, a country that was divided by the Iron Curtain, on the eastern side of which every country was dominated by Marxist totalitarian dictatorships. But even west of the Iron Curtain, Spain and Portugal were fascist governments through the 1970s. Greece was under the control of the colonels, a military junta. Almost all of Latin America was ruled by military dictatorships. In East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia were military dictatorships, all of them democratic today. And going back to another form of violence, interpersonal violence or violent crime, there's a general trend that in any state of anarchy, one gets high rates of violence. And this connects to my earlier discussion of violence in the archaeological record. But now turning to the recent historical record, where, well, not so recent, but let's say the last millennium, where we do have quantitative data on rates of homicide, we find that in medieval Europe, the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year. But then as the first kingdoms established control over the medieval feudal patchwork of fiefs, bringing their territories under control, the homicide rate declined in every European country, and so today it's approximately 1 per 100,000 per year, a decline by a factor of more than 35. And that process is repeated whenever governments bring their frontier regions under their control, so that the ethic of, or the violence reduction technique of revenge, leading to feuds and cycles of violence and vendettas, is replaced by a criminal justice system and the rule of law. It happened again in colonial New England. It happened again in the American Wild West. And it happened in Mexico, which still has a high rate of homicide, but a century ago its rate was 5 times as high. If we zoom in on the last 50 years or so, we see that after going through a reversal in the decline of homicide in the 1960s, when the United States and pretty much every Western country had a huge increase in the rate of violence, starting in the 90s, industrialized countries brought their rate of violence under control, and it fell in the United States by a factor of more than half. And in the world as a whole, the rate of homicide has fallen by about 35% just in the last 2 decades. In fact, we've been getting safer in just about every way because of advances in the design of automobiles and of highways. Your chance of getting killed in a car accident are 96% lower than they were a century ago. We are 88% less likely to be killed on the sidewalk as pedestrians, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die in a fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. But there is one exception to the trend of increasing safety in the United States. And that is the category that safety experts call poison by solid or liquid. It includes drug overdoses, and here you see the American opioid epidemic, an exception to the trend of increasing safety. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to die from an act of God, as we say in English. The droughts, floods, wildfires, volcanoes, tsunamis, heat waves, meteor strikes, and earthquakes, presumably not because God is any less angry with us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure, in early warning systems, and in emergency disaster responses. And what about the quintessential act of God, the projectile hurled by Zeus, the literal bolt from the blue? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge, the natural state of humanity, is to be illiterate and ignorant, and for most of history, only a privileged few could read and write. In early modern Europe, 15% of the population could read and write. 85% of Europeans were illiterate. The literacy rate was brought up to 100% in the 20th century in every European country and in the United States. And now that process is being replicated elsewhere, such as in Latin America by Chile and Mexico. And indeed, in the world as a whole, the world is now 80% literate, and among people under the age of 25, 90% literate. Compare that to 15% literacy in Europe several centuries ago. And in perhaps the most amazing, astonishing, incredible, difficult to swallow example of progress, we have been getting smarter. This is true. As unbelievable as it may sound, in a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing around the world by 3 points a decade. This is not due to any program of eugenics or selective breeding, but rather to the spread of public health and education, and probably to the proliferation of abstract concepts, visual symbols, technical terms from science and technology into everyday life. Okay, do any of these increases that economists like to measure actually make our lives any better? And the answer is they have. For example, in 1870, the average work week in Western Europe and the United States was 62 hours. Today it is less than 40. Because of the universal penetration of running water and electricity and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we lose to housework, which people say is their least favorite way of spending their time, has gone from more than 60 hours a week to less than 15 hours a week. And because our work week has been getting shorter and we waste less time on housework, the amount of leisure time has increased over the last 50 years, both among men and women. Now, you can't help but notice that the leisure time for women has leveled off. Why would that be true? It's because women today spend more time with their children. A single working woman today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mother did in the 1950s. So forget your nostalgia for the 1950s. Now is the age of family closeness. Well, do any of these gains make us any happier? And the answer is, on average, they do. There is, for one thing, a strong relationship between life satisfaction and income, gross domestic product per capita. This is plotted on a logarithmic scale, which means that an extra euro makes a poor person much happier than it makes a rich person. But nonetheless, it applies across the scale. Each dot is a country. Each arrow impaling a dot is represents the relationship between income and happiness within a country. So what the graph shows is that people in richer countries are happier. Within every country, richer people are happier. And the prediction is, as the world gets richer, its people should be getting happier. Do they? Well, for the data that we have, which is only spans about 40 years. In 86% of countries for which we do have longitudinal data, happiness has increased. The United States is not one of them, but Germany is. Here you have some data for Germany. And India and Russia, 2 other countries where happiness has increased. Germany, by the way, I looked it up, is the 15th happiest country out of 156 for which we have data, and with happiness increasing compared to 20 years ago. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of having a good attitude or seeing the glass as half full. It is a fact of human history, perhaps the greatest fact of human history. So how is this fact reflected in the news? Well, a study of the tone of the news using sentiment mapping, that is tallying the percentage of positive to negative news, has found that in all of these decades in which our lives have gotten longer, healthier, safer, better educated, more peaceful and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and a sample of the world's broadcasts has also gotten glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? Part of the reason comes from an interaction between our cognitive psychology and the nature of journalism, and to some extent history. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, a pair of cognitive psychologists. Tversky died in 1995. Kahneman went on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, in part for this work. Showed that the people estimate risk according to how easily they can recall examples from memory. We use our brain's search engine as a way of estimating frequency in the world. So if we read about a shark attack, then we don't go into the water because we think that sharks are a major menace. And people think that tornadoes kill more people every year than asthma attacks, whereas in fact asthma attacks kill 80 times as many people as tornadoes. But tornadoes are really fun to watch on television, and asthma attacks not so much. Well, in fact, consider the nature of news on television. News is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. You never see a reporter on TV saying, "I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace," or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. As long as the number of violent incidents in the world has not fallen to 0, there will always be enough to cover in the news, and that can drive our intuitions into thinking that violence is more prevalent than ever, or even that it has increased. Also, news by its very nature is about sudden events, not gradual changes. The economist Max Roser points out that the news could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. On top of these inherent distorters, there is a negativity bias in news media. Most journalists think that serious journalism is about threats and dangers and scandal and corruption, and that any positive development is advertising, propaganda, pravda, boasting that pig iron production is up 10% last year. And so there's together with the accidental distortions of journalism, there is something of a intentional distortion. This was satirized by the American humor newspaper called The Onion in the headline, "CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day." Well, if you combine the nature of our psychology with the nature of journalism, you can see why the world has been coming to an end for a very long time indeed. Well, let me end with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. First, you might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic so that we don't get complacent, we speak truth to power, we discover corruption and scandals? Well, not exactly. I suggest that it is good to be accurate. Of course we need to be aware of danger and suffering and injustice wherever it occurs, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because countering the danger of complacency on one side, there are dangers of indiscriminate pessimism on the other. One of them is fatalism. If you think that despite all the efforts to make the world a better place, things just keep getting worse and worse and worse, a natural response is, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? In fact, if you think that we are doomed, that if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence and robots will, the natural response is, well, let's just enjoy ourselves while we can. Nothing we can do about it. Let our grandchildren worry about it. The other danger of indiscriminate pessimism is radicalism. If you think our institutions are failing and are beyond all hope for reform, a natural response is to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground in the hope that anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have today. Or to empower a leader who promises, and these words will send a chill down the spine of every American, only I can fix it. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That wouldn't be progress. That would be a miracle. That would be magic. And progress is not magic. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, the world faces major challenges that have not yet been solved. Foremost among them are climate change and the threat of nuclear war. And I argue in my discussion of these existential threats in the book that we should treat them as problems that are unsolved but solvable rather than as apocalypses in waiting. That we should decarbonize the world's economy via a combination of policy, particularly carbon pricing and technology. That is the development of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies, including not just renewables, but nuclear power and carbon capture and storage. And we should deal with the threat of nuclear war by increasing international stability to prevent crises, to prevent miscalculations and misunderstandings, and the reduction of nuclear arms culminating in the total abolition of all nuclear weapons. A policy goal that was once seen as romantic, as something that only the beatniks and the hippies would want, but now has been embraced by an increasing number of realist Cold War hawks, including Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. Final question, does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Well, this is a pointed question for me because I have advocated the existence of human nature. Is humanism just too arid or tepid or flattened to get people's hearts pumping? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies, like Germany, are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, probably in the history of our species, and they are the prime destination of people who, as we say, vote with their feet. Also, I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is glorious, heroic, perhaps even spiritual. This is a hero story that is not just a myth. Myths are fictions, and this one is true. True to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, because it depends on nothing more than the conviction that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, peace is better than war, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you for listening, and thank you for this wonderful award. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We had an excellent talk, and I think there are probably a number of questions. Yes, please.
Amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. Can I just ask, where is liberty?
Where's what? Pardon me?
Liberty.
Liberty. Yes.
Yeah, from
Yes. So.
Stuart Mill, and nowadays the right to privacy, or from 100 years ago we have a passport, for instance. I think this is quite a new phenomenon. So how do you measure liberty?
Yes. So one measure of liberty is democracy. So that is freedom from government coercion. In fact, I think I have a picture of Mill in my gallery of Enlightenment thinkers and of Harriet Mill, not just John Stuart, among heroes of the Enlightenment, even though they're conventionally placed more in the age of classical liberalism than the age of Enlightenment, but I think it's a continuation of similar ideas. So yeah, so the increase of democracy would be suggest that liberty has increased, at least in parts of the world, although it is obviously threatened in other parts, such as Russia and Turkey and Poland. Other forms of liberty would include, even within democracies, the liberalization of laws against victimless crimes, such as homosexuality. So more and more countries have decriminalized homosexuality. Just last month, India decriminalized homosexuality. Other examples would be the reduction of child labor, which is a form of removal of liberty from children. And I did not present the graph tonight, but child labor has been going down. So I think most measures of liberty, not just democracy, have shown an overall increase, although again, not everywhere for everyone all the time. I'll mention one other thing. I didn't show this graph, but you can separate democracy from human rights, because democracies can impose the will of a majority of the people to oppress the minority of the people. And so it's harder to estimate human rights, but that would include freedom to speak out without being imprisoned, freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, freedom from torture, freedom from capital punishment. And one index of human rights has shown an increase. And this is a measure that's not identical to democracy, though it's partly correlated with it.
If you would take time, and I'm sure you're interested in criticizing yourself, if you sit down in the audience, what would be the most important critique you have against what you are saying?
Well, when I was writing Enlightenment Now, I took into account all of the counterexamples to human progress and devoted chapters to each one. So they would include inequality, the threat of nuclear war, climate change and other environmental forms of environmental degradation, the possible slowdown of economic growth, and the rise of authoritarian populism. So those would be 5 counterexamples to progress. To say what would I consider to be the most serious critiques is, since I consider them in writing the book, and try to anticipate them there and apply them, I'm probably not the person to ask this soon after writing the book, because I already took them into account as best I could. There's also, I'll mention one common line of criticism, which is that, well, weren't a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers also racists and sexists and anti-Semites? And they clearly were. But the point in advancing the Enlightenment ideas is not to say that there were a bunch of great guys in the second half of the 18th century. It's not that these thinkers were the secular prophets and messiahs and we should emulate them and praise them and worship them and parse their writings. That would defeat the whole purpose of the Enlightenment, which is to treat the ideas, not the people. So yes, a lot of them were scoundrels. Kant was a vicious racist, and Voltaire was an anti-Semite, and Jefferson not only kept slaves but had sex with them. So yeah, they were in many ways not necessarily nice people in every regard, but that's not why I cite them. I cite them for the ideas that are worth keeping. There's also a line of thinking that says that, well, didn't the Enlightenment give rise to Marxism, and thus the genocides and famines of and wars of the 20th century? Didn't it give rise to slavery and colonialism? And I do deal with those in the book because I think they're just wrong. Imperial expansion, colonization, and slavery were the rule in most of human history since civilization, and it's only with the Enlightenment that there were voices to reduce them. And the kind of romantic militarism that led to the world wars was, I think, more suitably situated in the counter-Enlightenment than the Enlightenment, the romantic movements that rose up in opposition to Enlightenment. But anyway, those are some of the debates that the book has sparked.
There was another question over there.
Yes.
With respect to climate change in the United States, and some people say, oh, it's not happening. I think it's often the poor people who are saying that, the ones that have been left behind. So they have to be, I don't know, educated, but how can you educate people that haven't got a lot of money to live on?
Yes, I don't think it's that it tracks poverty, except insofar as, well, poverty tracks education, correlates with education, and education correlates with left-right beliefs on average. But the big problem in the United States, it's some of the richest of the rich who are denying man-made climate change, like Charles and Robert Koch, who are throwing massive amounts of money to support political candidates who deny climate change, advertising. They are connected to the oil industry. And it's often, I think it's actually the problem of some of the wealthiest rather than the poorest. And there are interests connected to oil, connected to coal. That's obviously a problem in Germany as well. Yes?
Well, you criticized mass media and journalism, and rightly so, I think. But I was wondering about possible positive effects of media, like, for example, showing the horrors of war through photography or film or video, or showing the shared humanity, maybe, of different cultures, also these mass media, these technological wonders. And also creating possibly like a globalized culture where people that I was born in Argentina, I feel like share a lot with Germans in how I grew up and the things I consumed as a child. Of course, it's a personal anecdote, but I was just wondering, are there certain links showing that these new media have had a positive effect?
Yeah, well, clearly, no, I completely agree that the expansion of our circle of sympathy, driven by, is in large part driven from awareness of not just awareness of the suffering of other people, but the felt reality of it through photography and cinema, largely through journalism, but also through realistic fiction that puts us into the lives of other people. And there can't possibly be an argument to not present negative developments. The problem that I point out is that there is a bias to neglect any positive developments and to spin everything in the worst possible light. But I absolutely agree. In terms of evidence, I actually don't know of good quantitative evidence. We have reason to think that there's kind of historical evidence, such as the first successful anti-war movement was the one that brought the Vietnam War to an end in the early 1970s, or at least took the Americans out of Vietnam. And it was also said that the Vietnam War was the first war that was brought into people's living rooms with live television coverage. In other wars like World War I, the searing photographs of gassed soldiers and so on was censored during the war and only published in the 1920s. So that's a kind of a historical anecdote. Another one is the suspicion that the best-selling novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 1860s raised Americans' awareness of the suffering of slaves. And Abraham Lincoln famously said to its author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, "You're the little woman that started this big war." Now again, these are, and there is some evidence that reading fictional accounts from the vantage point of a stigmatized group increases sympathy for that stigmatized group. So you'd expect if fiction could do it, then journalism should be able to do it even more. Yes?
He was first, yeah.
I myself, I would underwrite most of your arguments, but my students wouldn't. Now, my students are utterly frightened, and they don't expect a bright future, which is kind of a paradox.
Yes.
And this is underscored by a fairly recent poll that was done more or less all over Europe, where about 80% of all the people think that things have become worse.
Yes.
And you dwelt at some point, on the role played by the media. I think your choice was broadcasting and print. And what we should, I think, shouldn't let out of sight is the role that is played by social media. So what we are facing is sort of a tornado or a tsunami of bad news, because they spread, as you rightly argued, spread more easily than the reverse. So that is what frightens me most, that people don't read books. They won't read your book. They would still look at their smartphones and become dumb.
Well,
that's a tragedy.
Some people read my book on their smartphones. So, yeah, I'm.
So how do you face that?
Yeah, I think there is I think it's a severe problem that there is a kind of irrational pessimism,
Right.
Including just outright errors on factual questions, such as what is the average life expectancy at birth? Is extreme poverty increasing or decreasing? Is death from infectious disease increasing or decreasing? And people are just misinformed. Majorities of people give the wrong answers. Perhaps not coincidentally, majorities of people in rich countries think the world is getting worse. Adding to the paradox is that the countries that have the highest percentage of optimists are poor countries, Nigeria and Kenya and China.
Bhutan.
Pardon, Bhutan?
Bhutan.
Bhutan, another poor country. So what this suggests, and there are data from probably the same opinion polls that you're thinking of, is that people's assessment of which way the world is going is not a reflection of their own life situation. Indeed, there's constantly a gap between any question that you ask a person of himself or herself and the answer to that question when you ask them about everyone else in their country. So people think we'll say they're happy, about 85%, say in a country like Germany or more. But if you ask them, what about other Germans? And they'll say, oh, they're miserable. How safe is your neighborhood? Very safe. How safe are your country's neighborhoods? Oh, it's a jungle. How good are your children's schools? Oh, school, not bad. How good are the schools in your country? They're terrible. And also people overestimate how conservative or reactionary their countrymen are. If you ask people questions on, like, do you believe in gay rights? Almost everyone says yes. What percentage of people in your country support gay rights? And they say, oh, 40%. And that's true of many liberal social issues. So how we get people to have a better awareness of the facts, because it's not a question of their own well-being or their own happiness. It's a view of the world that systematically misinforms them. And one possibility is that the journalism should focus not just on events, but on trends, and not just on trends when they suddenly go bad. I've noticed a bad habit of journalism, that when there's a trend of something getting better that occasionally shows reversals, every time there's a reversal, it's covered in the news, because it's news. All the years in which there's an improvement, it's not news. And so a newsreader could come up with the impression that something is getting worse and worse and worse, even as it gets better and better and better. So certain habits like presenting important data every year or every month when they come out as if they're news, regardless of whether they go up or down. Newspapers already report things like sports statistics, weather, stock market, even the horoscope every day. Why can't they present the release of the estimate of the world's battle deaths for the preceding year, or homicide rate, or CO2 emissions? This is not a recipe for presenting good news, because often the news is bad, but it is a way in which people can be better informed. And just take one example. In Germany, with the closure of nuclear power plants, German CO2 emissions went up because the missing electricity was supplied by coal. Simply knowing which way the CO2 emissions are going, if I don't know how often those data are released, if it's every month or every year or every week, but if that was a regular feature in newspapers, people would see the consequences of policy changes and they would just be smarter across the board. That's one possible corrective. And another is just to there is a widespread belief among intellectuals, chattering classes, the journalists, the academics, the critics, that it's only responsible to attack our institutions. And that the role of an intellectual is to be a critic of our institutions. Now, of course, problems, injustices should be criticized, but if the impression that we convey is that liberal democracy is just a pit of inequality and racism and sexism, then people will naturally think, well, who needs liberal democracy? Let's try, maybe having a dictator would be better, as many young people do think. Together with just a greater emphasis on data, the relentless negativity of journalists, intellectuals, critics, I think, has to be re-examined. And that's one of the things that I tried to do in the book.
We have a flood of data, and enlightenment is about thought. Are we losing our ability to think through things? Because we're so flooded with information, but not with conclusions.
So the sheer, there may be, we all have the experience of being kind of overwhelmed with information. But how much of that information gives us a more accurate understanding of the world is another question. I know I speak for most Americans, and I suspect this is also true in Europe, that far too much of my day and my mental time and energy goes over being outraged by Donald Trump. And reading the latest outrage, reading editorials that denounce him. Not that we should not be outraged, we should be outraged, I would argue. But how much extra insight and understanding I get from being outraged for 40 minutes a day as opposed to 10 minutes a day, I don't know when it comes to actually making decisions. So a lot of our attention captured by media is not information. It's outrage, it's positive and negative. And to reallocate the flow of information so that it's information that's more diagnostic of the state of the world, information that's more actionable, instead of reading incessantly about what a disaster it will be if we don't address climate change. There's been a lot of that. How many articles say, here's what we need to do to mitigate climate change? How can we get a carbon-free economy? What is the mixture of renewables, nuclear, carbon capture that will actually bring us to zero? Very, very few. So it's quantity, but it's also quality. Real information as opposed to being flooded with stuff.
Do you see a historical gradient in the magnitude of consequence? So today I'm living in a total rule book. There's rules for absolutely everything. So the consequence 100 years ago, 200 years ago, would have been my personal death. I can cope with my personal death. Nowadays, I worry about the future of my children and my grandchildren. So how does that affect your theory?
Well, the many ways in which our social life is organized by rules, as opposed to by charisma, by blood connections, is one of the most striking trends of modernity. Max Weber pointed this out, that there's been a shift in social organization toward fiduciary rules and responsibilities, legal, rational frameworks, as opposed to, say, entrusting a charismatic leader or someone with a claim to a divine source of truth, or doing what the patriarch has done and everyone in your lineage has done. The exception that proves the rule is what has happened in the rise of populist, nationalist authoritarian movements, such as in the United States under Donald Trump, who is contemptuous of rules that constrain his own power and glory, such as an autonomous justice department. He operates almost, it's breathtaking to see how innocent and naive he is in this anti-modern attitude that government is giving leadership over to a leader who rules by voicing the authentic purity of the people and who is vested with complete authority, including authority to make his family, give power to his family members, to enrich himself, as opposed to the idea that a leader in a modern society is bound by rules and his only power is what the rules entitle him to. So we see in the modern, anti-modern, Enlightenment, anti-Enlightenment clash exactly the contrast between living one's life, at least in the social sphere, according to rules and rational conventions, as opposed to the traditional sources of authority coming from human nature, such as shared genes, dominance, group solidarity, and others.
Thank you.